Good evening, Conlangers. We are now in the final stretch of creating this language's grammar. I reckon it'll only be a couple more episodes before we're ready to move on to the writing system, and after that, the only thing left to do is make the showcase video. So the end is in sight, and I am really excited to get this language finished. So first on the agenda for today is to thank the patrons once again, with a special shout out to patron Harry Cook for getting in touch with me after the last episode and providing me with some very useful information and advice, which brings us to the first item of follow-up. So if you recall, one of the things that we worked out last episode is how exactly we handle reflexives, because what was the reflexive in the proto-lang has become this just sort of generic middle mediopassive kind of thing, which, depending on how it's used, can either be a regular passive, where you restate the agent, it can be a reflexive, a reciprocal, or potentially an antipassive. And I felt like we should have some way of clarifying when you're using it as an actual reflexive. So I thought I would use the adverb that means alone, because the World Lexicon of Grammaticalization lists that as one of the lexical sources for reflexives. And at the time that made sense to me, but shortly after the last episode, Harry Cook got in touch with me, because his academic work actually focuses on reflexives, and he pointed out that this strategy of using an adverb is not very practical, or at the very least it's quite imprecise. And it would be far more likely, if there were going to be some sort of clarifying element in there, that said element would be a pronoun. Because if it's a pronoun, then it can act as a verbal argument, so it can co-index with whatever the reflexivized element is. So if we had a sentence like, the man gave the money to himself, then just using the adverbial strategy, it would be, the man gave the money alone. Or I guess, the man was given the money alone. So like, the argument structure is not really that recoverable. Whereas if we used a pronoun that meant something like self, and then that pronoun took case marking, then it would be like, the man was given money to himself. And that much more clearly communicates the argument structure of the verb. And apparently this is a process that a lot of languages go through, where they start out with having some sort of middle voice or mediopassive or some sort of other valency changing operation that's done purely through verb morphology. And then over time they take a noun like body or soul or self, and then that becomes a specific reflexive pronoun. And then over time that pronoun becomes the main marker of reflexivity, and then that reflexive pronoun may actually end up getting used with the active voice, and the middle might either fall out of favor or just stick around in a few fossilized forms. So we could say that takvamir is in the first steps of this process, where there's a new reflexive pronoun that most of the time will get used with the detransitive/mediopassive, but also, as Harry pointed out, using just the detransitive/middle voice on its own, without using the reflexive pronoun, might still be a viable strategy for certain low-agency verbs, or unaccusative verbs especially, like verbs that naturally have some sort of patientive quality to them, like to wash or to shave, for example. Like if I say, I shaved this morning, the default assumption is that I mean I shaved myself. It would be kind of weird if I said that and I meant that I shaved someone else. In fact, even just saying, I shaved myself this morning, sounds strange and vaguely unsettling. Or verbs that are naturally reciprocal as well. So a verb like to kiss, like the default expectation is that there are two participants performing the action to each other. Because like if you say, two people kissed, you just assume that means they kissed each other. You don't need to use the full reciprocal construction there. So there are certain verbs like that would pretty much always take this mediopassive, which is more or less how you end up with deponent verbs in ancient Greek and Latin. So deponent verbs are verbs that look passive, and they take all of the typical passive morphology, but they have active meanings. So like in Latin, some of the classic examples are loquor, which means I speak, but judging by the endings you would think it would mean I am spoken. And another one I think is conetor, which means I try, but it's literally I am tried, which is always really weird when you first come across it when you're studying Latin. And it's even weirder in ancient Greek because there are some verbs that are only deponent in the future tense for some reason. And the reason why this happens is ultimately just because the semantics of these verbs just meant that they were associated or most frequently used with the middle voice. And so even though Latin lost the middle voice, you still have these fossilized forms that are sort of weirdly between active and passive. So all that is to say, we need a reflexive pronoun, which, as I say, is very likely to come from a word that means body or soul or something along those lines. And as it happens, we already have a proto-word that means body, because that's giving rise to our adjectivizing suffix. So that seems like a prime candidate. So I'm pretty sure the word for body would be animate. So let me just quickly go through all these forms. I can't actually immediately think if there's any situation in which we'd get a reflexive pronoun in the nominative. If this word survives into the modern language with the meaning of body, then that would certainly need a nominative form. But equally, we could just very easily say that this old word for body has been superseded by some other word, and at this point this reflexive pronoun is just purely used as a reflexive pronoun. Well, just in case there is some situation that I cannot foresee, we'll leave the nominative in for now. The locative form is hin, which I'm pretty sure is also the inanimate form of the word that means small. But that's fine, homophones are a thing. There we go. Pretty straightforward. And then for the reciprocal, we could either come up with another pronoun that basically just means each other, or we could do the same construction as the reflexive and then just stick in this opposingly adverb that we've been using up till this point, which is apparently what Vedic Sanskrit does, and I think I prefer that option. Now, theoretically, the adverb that we had, the word that means alone, could still be used as a sort of emphatic reflexive element, like if you really want to specify that the verb was in fact reflexive. And Harry brought up the idea that there could be essentially different levels of reflexivity depending on the semantics of the verb. So like we said, some verbs would be fine to just take the detransitive and that's it. Most verbs would require the reflexive pronoun, but if you really want to get across a reflexive, if you're just dealing with a verb that it would be very surprising to be in the reflexive, then you could use the adverb to just really hammer it in. But to go along with this idea of degrees of reflexivity, this reflexive pronoun that we have just means body, which just by itself is perfectly viable. But another more sort of emphatic option is to add a pronoun. Like in English you don't say I see self, you say I see myself. Now, if we just used a straight-up genitive pronoun, that would be pretty much indistinguishable from English, which I don't love. But Harry brought up the point of potentially using person clitics, which is something I've actually been idly thinking about for a while now. I've gone ahead and added it to our to-do list, because on one hand, I do kind of like the idea of having person clitics, just because, as I've said before, I generally don't like stray pronouns cluttering up the sentence, and if we just say that these pronouns need to prosodically lean on some other word, then that helps to clean things up quite a lot. And also it would be kind of a nice way of having polypersonal agreement without actually having polypersonal agreement. Like if object pronouns just had to criticize onto one of the verbal elements. So that's quite appealing, but on the flip side, number one, this might just be me, but I always think of person clitics as being a very European thing, especially Romance. Like my mind immediately goes to Spanish and Italian. I'm sure it occurs in other languages too, but I very heavily associate it with those. And at that point, that might make the language feel a bit too European-y. And number two, that's more or less what I did in Okolawak, where the object markers on the verb are actually just cliticized pronouns, which is why in auxiliary verb constructions and a couple of other situations, the object marking kind of jumps around a little bit. So I don't know if I want to do the same thing twice. I'm going to have a think about it, but again, if we did that, that would be yet another possibility for sort of degrees of reflexiveness. Like, if you just use the word for body on its own, that would be enough to convey the reflexive. But if you use a person clitic as well, then that just really drives it home. So I'm going to have to keep thinking about that. But for the time being, I think it's safe to say that we have the basics of reflexives and reciprocals worked out. So thanks again to Harry for getting in touch and helping me out with that. But that's not all, because I actually have another shout-out. Because in the last episode we talked a lot about content clauses and about infinitival complements, and whether or not non-finite verb forms should take case marking, and I was kind of on the fence about the whole thing. But a commenter by the name of, I believe it was Onnipuliainen, forgive me, my Finnish isn't great, they left a comment that led me down a rabbit hole of looking at Finnish verbal nouns, which I remember looking at a very, very long time ago and being very confused by. There's a lot of very interesting stuff going on, because there are 5 different infinitives, which all have slightly different uses. But the important thing is that at least some of them are required to take case marking. And interestingly, some of them also require their objects to occur in the genitive, which I did not know beforehand. And as Onnipuliainen points out, it may be that the reason why infinitives do not take case marking in most European languages is because the infinitive ultimately derives from a reanalyzed locative or some other sort of prepositional construction. Whereas if the non-finite form just comes from a noun, then it may well be expected to take case marking. And so yeah, I'm pretty sure that our verbal noun, which I am tentatively calling the gerund, it could equally be called an infinitive or probably any number of other things, but I'm just going to stick with gerund for now. I'm pretty sure our gerund is going to inflect 4 case forms as well. That would just make it a lot more flexible in general. And also, after playing around with forms a little bit, I decided I liked it best with an H in there. So essentially, the gerund is identical to the second principal part, except you swap out the final R for an H, and then you apply case marking. So pretty straightforward. Also, both Onnipuliainen and Logan Kersley, who we're going to get back to in a little bit, pointed out that in Finnish, German, and Russian, they all handle content clauses in a broadly similar way, in that you use a pronoun that takes the case marking, and then you follow that with the complementizer, followed by the content clause. In Finnish, you just use the normal third-person pronoun. In German, you use a demonstrative, and in Russian, you use the interrogative pronoun. And also, I believe in all 3 of them, if the content clause is serving as the object of a verb, or in other words, if the pronoun would be in the accusative, then the pronoun can be omitted. So I think I might do the same thing. And I think for the pronoun, I'll just go with the normal third-person pronouns, which, after all, came from demonstratives anyway, so that's sort of covering both bases. Whereas in the case of Russian, using the interrogative pronoun, from the resources that I found, I'm still not 100% sure how it works in some instances, because, I can't immediately think how you would tell the difference between I like that he is eating versus I like what he is eating. I'm sure there's a way of disambiguating things, but from at least one resource I found, it seemed to imply that the only way to tell the difference is just through prosody, which surprises me. But if we just go with the generic third-person pronoun, I don't think we should run into much trouble. So unless there's something I'm overlooking, I think we are content to cross content clauses off the list. But wait, there's more follow-up. Because last time, when we were doing the example sentence, I sort of decided in the moment that the dual form of the noun would take singular verb agreement, because I was kind of envisioning the dual as meaning a pair of something, like a single unit of 2 of something, which would therefore take the singular. But the more I thought about it, the more I think it would actually be more likely for it to take the plural, because the dual is coming from the numeral 2. And we've said that the numeral 2 is kind of inherently dual, because if we didn't, then we'd need to apply the dual suffix onto the numeral for 2. And thinking about it, it just feels more natural to me that that would, in the proto-lang, be associated with plurality. So when the classifiers are turning into the gender suffixes, they would originally come from sort of collective meanings of groups of things. And in fact, as part of Onnipuliainen's message, they also mentioned that even if the dual does start out as triggering singular agreement, it would be pretty easy to justify reanalysis taking place, and for it to later on take plural agreement. So yeah, in any case, I do think I'm going to change that and say that the dual does in fact take plural agreement on verbs. It just seems a lot neater now that I think about it. And Onnipuliainen also mentioned, with regards to the singular on the numeral 1, because last time I was trying to figure out whether we should treat the numeral for 1 as just being inherently singulative, or whether or not we should also add the singulative ending onto it. And Onnupuliainen suggested that using the numeral without the singulative could be more archaic, whereas by the time of the modern language it would be expected to have the singulative. And I quite like that idea. Like, the singulative would originally have been more emphatic, but then it just got overused to the point where now you just sort of are expected to use it. And if you don't use it, that just seems a bit old-fashioned. I'm trying to think of a real-world parallel, because I feel like something like this does happen in English. The only example I can think of, this isn't really the same thing, but the word whatsoever. It used to be much more common to just say whatever. Like, you could say, this tangent has no relevance to our discussion whatever. Whereas these days I think most people would say whatsoever in that circumstance. Again, not really the same thing, but kind of a similar vibe. So yeah, I quite like that idea, and I think that is what I'm going to do. So thank you very much to Onnupuliainen for a very insightful and multifaceted comment. Also, while we're on the subject of numbers, I got quite a few comments of people pointing out languages where there is in fact an ordinal for 0. So it's a lot more common than I would have thought. So yeah, I think it's pretty reasonable to say that this language has an ordinal for 0 as well. Also, I realized I made a mistake for numbers above 20, because originally the expression that I had for beyond 20 was koronmin, because I thought the word for 20 would need to be in the locative, since it's the object of the preposition beyond. But then I realized that the word for 20 is inanimate, and inanimate nouns don't have a distinct locative form, so it would just be in the nominative, so it would just be kormin. And speaking of mistakes, looking back at the example sentence from last episode, I can't believe I didn't notice at the time that this word kisvas is not phonotactically viable for 2 different reasons. Number 1, that first S there should be roticizing, because it's between 2 voice segments, so it should be kirvas. But then I realized that the protoform that this word is coming from, the initial K is before an I, which means that the K would become a palatal stop, which later turns into an S. So the actual correct form of the word should be sirvas. I don't know how it took me so long to figure out that that form is wrong. Okay, and with that, I think we are done with follow-up, and we're ready to start crossing more of these off the list. Now, first of all, before we get into any of these properly, I'd like to start off with a question for you all, because one of the major things on the list is to finalize our declensions and our verb conjugations, because we've been keeping track of all the different forms for all the different words we have, but we have not yet gone through and sorted them into different declensions and conjugations. So my question to you all would be, is that something that you would actively want to see me do in an episode, or would you rather me do that off-air? Because it would be, I think, a pretty boring thing to watch, because there's no creative decisions involved, there's no new words or new pieces of grammar being created. It would just be me going through a very long list of nouns and verbs, and grouping them by their endings into different categories. Because if you reckon that would be too boring to actually do in an episode, then I could just do all that work off-air, and then open the following episode just by presenting the different patterns that I've found. Doesn't really make much of a difference to me which one. I'm just more curious about whether or not people would want to see that. So do let me know your thoughts on that. Another quick thing that we might as well get out of the way now. Something I've added to the list is resultative complements. So this is something along the lines of, I painted the fence white. So white in this sentence is basically describing the result of the verb. Like, I painted the fence, and as a result of that, the fence is now white. So basically, how does this language handle that? And this is another situation in which I'm not actually sure what the possibilities are. Like, I don't know what the cross-linguistic tendencies for how to handle this are. Because in English, you just kind of put the adjective at the end. And as far as I can think, Mandarin does pretty much the same thing, where you just put the resultative just after the verb. And I think Turkish works in more or less the same way. And the only other real way I could think of phrasing that would be something like, I painted the fence so that it was white. But that seems a bit verbose, and I would reckon there would be some more concise way of saying it. So for this language, all I can immediately think of is to either do the same thing and just put the adjective at the end of the phrase, or to put the adjective in a particular form, like, say, the locative. So it would be like, I painted the fence towards white, which isn't that different than the to death construction in English. Like if you say, I've worked myself to death. Of course, in that case, death is a noun, not an adjective. But if we have locative forms of adjectives, then, I don't know, that kind of makes sense to me. I tried looking up how different languages handle this, and the results I found were not particularly useful. So if any of you have any information about this, please do let me know. But the main thing that I want to talk about today is coordination. Because the topic of coordination has come up in previous episodes, but I still haven't actually committed to a particular strategy. We do already have some conjunctions. We've got this word that means but or however, which would be our adversative conjunction, I believe. And we've got these words or and or not. But we do not yet have a word for and. Now, I did mention a while back that I had this idea that the adverbial ending would be cognate with the word for and, because both of them would ultimately come from a word that means with. However, the implications that would have on case marking kind of confused me, because if the word for and comes from a word that means with, then I would think that the noun would need to occur in a particular case, which feels kind of strange because the whole point of coordinating constructions is the things that you are coordinating are equivalent. And this is where we bring up Logan Kersley again, because he, along with co-hosts Jacob and Aidan, talked about coordination on an episode of the Theory Neutral podcast, which I'll have a link to that. And I think I've mentioned before that in that episode, Logan points out that in Russian, coordination of subjects involves using the comitative, which is very interesting, but I don't think I'm going to do it for this language. Because I've been thinking about things a little bit more, and I actually went back and re-listened to that Theory Neutral episode, and specifically in that episode they're discussing this paper by Martin Haspelmatt, which is a really good and useful overview of how coordination works cross-linguistically. So I had a read through it in preparation for this episode, and it did spark some ideas. So I think the first place to start is with the fact that there are different levels at which coordination can operate, and the three main distinctions are between noun phrases, so like the cat and the dog, between verb phrases, the man is smiling and laughing, and the clause level, like I like drinking tea and my friend likes drinking coffee. So depending on the language, these different levels of coordination will be dealt with using different coordinators. So like in English, we just use and to handle all three of those, but there are some languages that group the verb phrase and the clause level using one coordinator and have a separate coordinator for noun phrases, whereas some languages group the noun phrase and the verb phrase using one coordinator and have a separate one specifically for clauses, and some use different coordinators for all three of them. However, as the paper points out, there is no attested language that uses the same strategy for noun phrases and clauses and a different strategy for verb phrases. So in this language, I am cognizant of the fact that we have converbs, and it's pretty common in languages that have converbs to have a specific consecutive or sequential converb, or just a simultaneous converb, that implies that the action of two different verb phrases are happening simultaneously, which effectively fills the function of coordination between verb phrases and clauses. Like in Turkish you have the ip ending. Like off the top of my head you could say something like gidip okuyorum. So okuyorum means I am reading, and gidip is the stem for the verb that means to go, with this ip ending, which is a converb form. So it loosely means like, after going, I am reading, but it's usually translated as, I am going and reading. Like it has a specific sort of simultaneous or consecutive reading to it. So in our case, we could totally just say that the imperfective converb can also be used to express simultaneity. So to say, I am laughing and smiling, you can just say, I am laughing while smiling. But it does raise the question of whether or not we have a specific consecutive converb. And that kind of brings up clause chaining, which is something else that's on the to-do list. Essentially, I'm wondering how many converbs this language should have. because so far we've only got 3, which are serving as the first 3 principal parts. Now, I adore converbs. I think they're immensely useful, but at the same time, I'm not sure I want to have too many converbs in this language, because that was one of Nakashti's, signature features, because it has, over a dozen converbs, and they do pretty much all the work when it comes to clause chaining and combining clauses, and they've got lots of derivational properties and all sorts of stuff. So I don't think I want to go that crazy with converbs this time around. And plus, if we have a bunch of other converbs that all have their own sort of implications to do with tense and aspect, we've got to figure out how that jives with our neat little tense aspect mood matrix, which I would rather keep as it is if possible. I'm going to come back to the issue of a consecutive converb later, but I'm content in saying that the first principal part can be used to coordinate clauses, and I think it's only natural then that it would also be used to coordinate verb phrases. I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't apply to verb phrases as well. Although it's worth noting that in Turkish you do have this consecutive construction, but equally there is a coordinator ve, which I'm pretty certain is related to Arabic wa, that you can use instead. So whether you use the converb form or this word ve, the sentence functionally still means the same thing, and as far as I understand, it's just the freedom of the speaker to choose whichever one they want. So we could do something similar, where we have some coordinator that's used for noun phrases, because obviously using a converb is not going to be an option for noun phrases, because you would need a verb for the converb form to attach to, and noun phrases you don't have one of those, so necessarily noun phrases are going to have their own coordinator. But we could say that the noun phrase coordinator can optionally be used in verb phrases too, and potentially even the clause level. Like in Turkish, I think you can use ve to coordinate clauses as well. So we could just say that there's one catch-all coordinator for all of them, but then for verb phrases and clauses you have this other option. Or we could say that noun phrases have their own coordinator that is exclusive to them, that can't be used for verb phrases or clauses. Or I guess we could say it's mandatory for noun phrases, optional for verb phrases, and cannot be used in clauses. Well, first of all, let's figure out what this noun phrase strategy actually is. Because the 3 main options are asyndetic coordination, which is you don't have a word that means and, you just put the 2 nouns next to each other. And just the fact that they're in juxtaposition, it's just understood that they're being coordinated. So to say the cat and the dog, you just say the cat, the dog. Then you have monosyndetic coordination, which is what English does, where you have a word for and that usually goes in between the words that it coordinates, although in rare cases it can come afterwards, like in Latin with the que suffix. And then if you're coordinating more than 2 things, you say the cat and the dog and the mouse, then the coordinator comes in between all of them. But it's also apparently very common in monosyndetic languages, like in English, you can get rid of the superfluous coordinators and just say the cat, the dog, and the mouse. And it's not until you get to the last coordinand that you realize that, oh yeah, this is a coordinating construction. And only the last pair of coordinands actually need a coordinator. And then you've got bisyndetic coordination, which I'm fairly certain is not as common as the other options. But in this case, every coordinand needs to have an accompanying coordinator. So it would be like the cat and, the dog and, the mouse and. All 3 of them need the word and after them. So I don't think we need to do anything too fancy for this. I think I'm happy to just stick with monosyndetic coordination. But I do like the idea that the coordinator, rather than being a separate word, is actually an affix. Because the paper actually mentions that, unlike other conjunctions like or but, the word for and is reasonably likely to become a clitic. And I'm fairly certain that this is the case in Arabic, because you've got the word wa, which means and if I'm remembering correctly, it is a proclitic on the second coordinand. And I quite like that idea. Because, interestingly, and this is something that they discuss on the Theory Neutral podcast as well, you would think that in a coordinating construction, the coordinator would not really be dependent in any sense on either of the coordinands, because the whole point is that it connects them and says these 2 are sort of equivalent. But in a lot of cases, the coordinator actually leans more on one coordinand than the other. So in English you could say something like, I went to the shop and bought milk. Oh, and cheese too. So that second bit, oh and cheese too, is basically an afterthought, but it begins, other than the interjection oh, it begins with a coordinator. Whereas apparently you couldn't say something like that in Japanese because the coordinator leans more on the first coordinand, and therefore you would need some dummy word like a demonstrative. So you would have to say, oh, that and I bought cheese. And that's really, really interesting. So having the coordinator be a clitic kind of piggybacks off of that idea, and the question immediately becomes, which coordinand does the coordinator cliticize onto? Because it could either be a suffix on the first coordinand, or a prefix on the second coordinand, or if we wanted to go full Latin, we could have it be a suffix on the second coordinand, but I don't want to do that because that is very Latin, and apparently it's very rare. And again, in the Theory Neutral podcast, Logan brings up the point that you might imagine that the clitic could also be a prefix on the first coordinand, but apparently that possibility is simply not attested. There is no known language that does that. And there are various potential theoretical reasons why, but that's not particularly relevant for what we're talking about. So if it's a suffix on the first coordinand, or I suppose equally a suffix on the second coordinand, then we'd have to worry about how it interacts with case marking, at least at the phonological level. Because I quite like the idea that the clitic undergoes some sort of phonological changes to assimilate to the word that it's cliticizing with. Like, just off the top of my head, if the clitic ends in a nasal, and it attaches as a prefix to the second coordinand, then that nasal could assimilate in place of articulation to the initial consonant of the coordinand it's attaching to. And how exactly that manifests would depend on what stage of the language it became a clitic. Yeah, I think I'm leaning towards it being a prefix, because if it's a suffix, then again that has implications for how the case endings shorten up. We have to worry about things like word final vowel loss and other stuff like that. It just feels messier to do it that way. Whereas if it's a prefix, nouns at this point I don't really think have any prefixes, other than some derivational elements. So we'd have a very similar situation to Arabic. So I guess we just go ahead and choose a form for it. So it occurs to me that if we went with the idea that the coordinator ends in a nasal, and the nasal needs to assimilate to the initial consonant of the coordinand, if the coordinand starts with an S, depending on what point of history the clitic evolved, specifically if it evolved before roticization happened, then any noun that begins with an S, when it's part of a coordinating construction, the S will turn into an R. Or, if the clitic evolved more recently, then we'll just have a regular NS sequence, which is one of the only times in the language that you would get that. And I don't love either of those options. And that would also be the case if the clitic ended with L or R as well, or really any voiced segment, like even a vowel, unless it ended with, say, a voiced stop, which would necessarily mean that it would have evolved relatively recently after word final vowel loss, because voiced stops aren't allowed to end a word until word final vowel loss happens. Now, word final vowel loss happens after metathesis, so if we say that the coordinator ended in, say, a D, then when it cliticizes onto an S initial word, we'll get a cluster like adsa, which does not ordinarily occur in this language, so I can see that either becoming atsa or adza, just so that the two segments share the same voicing. Now with atsa, this happens after stop fricative metathesis has happened, so this would be the only instance in the language in which you would get a TS sequence, which is kind of weird. Whereas with adza, again, metathesis wouldn't happen, and that Z would eventually turn into an R, so it would become adra, which again is not a sequence that happens anywhere else in the language. I also realize that this is long after vowel harmony has happened, so whatever the vowel is in the clitic, it's not going to harmonize with the coordinand, which I think I'm okay with, because I don't want this coordinator to be too overtly a prefix. Like, it's a proclitic, sure, but it still behaves differently than just a typical prefix. Like, there's a phonological clue in there that this is still kind of a separate word. So I'm trying to think about what final sound would lead to the most interesting phonological changes. We run into the initial S problem if we use any voiced sound, whereas if we use a voiceless stop, we end up with a stop S cluster that in all other parts of the language would be metathesized. I'm trying to find a way to make this work. One idea that occurs to me is, in Italian, there's this thing that I don't actually know if it has an English name, but in Italian it's called raddoppiamento fonosintattico, which is basically, if you have a word that ended in a consonant in Latin that has since been lost in Italian, that has the effect of geminating the initial consonant of the following word. So a phrase like to the house or at the house isn't a casa, it's a casa. That C is actually geminated because the a preposition came from the Latin ad. So ad casa would have turned into a casa. So could we do that here? Could we say that the coordinator ends with, let's just say, a D, at least when it first evolves, but by the time that it becomes a clitic, it just has the effect of geminating the first consonant of whatever comes after it? Or if the following word doesn't begin with a consonant, we could say that the D remains as a fricative, because that sound change happens after word final vowel loss. And come to think of it, I think we could also get away with using H for the same thing. Like if we just hijack the Italian here, pretend it was actually a casa, becomes a casa. Yeah, I think that works. And then it would remain H intervocalically. Now, does it geminate all following consonants? Or does it stick around in front of some of them? And now this is actually making me think of the Arabic sun and moon letters, where the L in the definite article will assimilate to some following consonants, but not others. So we have a coordinator that behaves like the Arabic coordinator, but also like the Arabic definite article. Two phonological results of this. Be either a geminate or a preceding H. So we know there would definitely be an H surfacing if the following word is vowel initial. And I'm thinking also for liquids, whereas I think everything else would just be a geminate. It's not like those sequences would necessarily be phonotactically inviolable. Like we have HV sequences and HT sequences all over the place. It just feels to me, for whatever reason, like those would be more likely to lose the H. Okay, we've established that it ends in an H, but what does it begin with? We really don't have very many initial L's. Could use some more of those, but at the same time, I'm now cognizant that this coordinator is going to be very Arabic-like, and if we make the coordinator like la, that's going to be very reminiscent of the Arabic al. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I think that L might be the best option, because I'm trying to think about what consonants sound good when they're followed by a geminate, and by and large, I don't like stops in that position. V is okay, but we've already used V quite a lot. The nasals are also okay, but again, we've used those a lot. We've got R's all over the place. Yeah, I think I'm just going to go with L. And then for the vowel, we can't have O or after an initial L, because in order to get either of those, we would need to have an U that was lowered, unless we say that the word used to contain one of the consonants that cause vowel lowering, but I'm pretty sure that would result in a long vowel, which I don't want, because I think this clitic is never going to be stressed, unless you just really wanted to emphasize it for whatever reason. Like if someone asks, do you like cats or dogs? You could say, oh, I like cats and dogs. We could get li if we say the initial consonant was originally a palatal L. If we went with a central vowel, that would be very reminiscent of the French le, another definite article. Same with la, and li is very Italian. It depends on how much we want to lean into the fact that the clitic doesn't participate in vowel harmony. Because if we went with E is the neutral vowel, so that means it wouldn't participate in harmony no matter what. Whereas if it were A or then it would stand out much more. It might just be my English bias that I want to put a schwa in that position because it's not stressed. And then the protoform would be something like luha. Okay, so that is coordination for noun phrases done. So the question is, can you also do this with verb phrases, and potentially clauses? So I was thinking about the possibility of our coordinator prefixing onto our auxiliaries, if we wanted to say that we could combine verb phrases and or clauses, and I had kind of a fun idea, one that I don't think I'm actually going to go with, but it's still fun nonetheless. So in most languages, you have this thing called conjunction reduction, where if you have two verb phrases that share the same subject, you don't need to restate the subject or to even use a pronoun. Like in English, you don't need to say, I went to the shop and I bought some milk. You can just say, I went to the shop and bought some milk. So in the second verb phrase, there isn't an obvious subject because it's assumed to carry over from the first phrase. And as far as I understand, most languages do that. But what if the word for and became an affix on the verb, and then once person marking became a thing, then because the word for and eliminated the need for there to be a subject pronoun on the verb, then the prefixed word for and could be reanalyzed as what is effectively a same subject marker. Like, this verb has the same subject as the preceding verb, whereas if you use the normal third-person subject marker, then that would specifically mean that it's a different reference to the one in the previous verb, and before you know it, you end up with a switch reference system. I've never really looked too deeply into the evolution of switch reference. Like, for all I know, that could just be the standard way that switch reference evolves. But that is kind of a fun idea. Now, it's way, way too late to do that for this language, but I might file that away and use that for a future language at some point. Anyway, coordinating verb phrases. So, as far as I can immediately think, if you're going to be coordinating verb phrases, then you necessarily have to restate the auxiliary. Because if you didn't, then that would just be a converb clause, and it wouldn't make sense to have a coordinator in there. And to me, that makes it feel a lot more explicit than just using the converb construction. And maybe, because of that, maybe we could use that as a justification for why you can't use it for verb phrases. You know, something that occurs to me about the Turkish example. In Turkish, as far as I'm aware, the ip converb has to come before the lexical verb, which makes the prospect of stating an afterthought inherently kind of more difficult. Because if you wanted to say something like, I am going, oh, and I'm reading, then using the ve coordinator lets you do that pretty easily. But can you do that with the converb construction? Because the fact that the converb comes first kind of means that you already need to be aware of the fact that you're coordinating things before you begin the utterance. So I guess that would be one advantage of using the lch coordinator over using the converb form. So maybe the converb form is preferred in verb phrases, but you can optionally use the nominal coordinator purely for afterthoughts, simply because I don't really know what the alternative would be. The only alternative I can think of is if you essentially had some sort of dummy verb, like, say, the copula, that you could put in the converbial form. So it would be kind of hard to translate that into English, but it would be something like, I am going, oh, it is, and I am reading. Okay, let's run with that for the time being. Let's just say that lch is pretty much exclusively used for nouns, and to use it in any other situation is kind of marked. Whereas for verb phrases and clauses, a converb construction is preferred. In which case, do you just use the first principal part? Or is there a consecutive converb? Or is there some other converb that is specifically used in coordination? Because like in Turkish, as far as I'm aware, this ip form, that's pretty much always used in sentences that we would translate in English with coordination. And there are other converbs for while and when, etc. So what do we want to do here? Well, like I said earlier, I don't really want to go too crazy with converbs, but something that I did in Nakashti that I would not want to replicate here is that in Nakashti all of the converbs are very, not necessarily regular, they all are very clearly defined. Like, they all have exactly one function. Whereas in a lot of languages with converbs, each converb might have quite different uses in different contexts, and certain converbs may overlap in meaning in some ways. Also, something that happens quite a lot in languages with converbs that I didn't do to my memory at all in Nakashti is that you sometimes get compound converbs, where you get certain converb forms that evolve from other converb forms with just like additional marking on them. So if we did that, then we would have our three sort of primary converbs and various other converbs that were built off of them. Because like I said, the first principal part kind of inherently comes with a simultaneous meaning. while doing something, which is very similar to a meaning of and. Whereas the consecutive, I did this and then I did that, that would be more the third principle part, because it's like, having done this, I did that. So I guess we could just leave it at that, or we could try and add some elements on to refine the meaning a little bit. Like for the third principle part, I'm thinking, if we had some word that means like directly or straight, then the converb would mean something like, directly from doing this, I did that. Whereas if you just use the third principle part on its own, that just sort of means that something has happened in the past, but it doesn't necessarily imply consecutiveness. And I know there are some languages that have, I think it's called an immediative converb, which is sometimes translated into English as soon as. So like, as soon as I did this, I did that. And I don't know how much that overlaps with consecutiveness. I just went down a bit of a research rabbit hole that culminated in me finding this paper about achvach. I'm pretty certain I've read through this paper before when I was doing research for the converb video I made several years ago. But achvach has a ton of converbs, including one that's called the posterior converb, which encodes that the action of the main verb follows the event encoded by the posterior verb. So basically a consecutive or sequential. And then it has multiple different simultaneous converbs. But this is the really interesting bit. Apparently, it is hypothesized that the posterior and the simultaneous came from the imperfective and perfective, respectively, that were both suffixed with this word that means at the moment. That is really interesting. Also, it mentions that the meaning of posteriority can be emphasized by putting the word after, immediately after the posterior converb. So we have a word that means time or moment, because that's giving rise to our word for when. So to make a meaning of at the time, we just need to put that in the locative, which would have originally been achahin, but then that vowel would be lost, and that would ultimately turn into a geminate H, umlaut would happen, and I reckon we could justify that getting stuck directly onto the first principle part, because the first principle part also comes from the accusative, which would have come from to or at, so it's at the time at which something happened. Now, depending on when this happens in history, that initial I might remain a low vowel if it gets leveled by vowel harmony first. So take the first principal part of any verb and stick this ending on it, and then you specifically have a simultaneous meaning. Like, I'm sure in a lot of cases the first principal part would get across the meaning perfectly fine, but if you really want to stress that the two things happened at the same time as each other, then you use this. And then theoretically, you could do exactly the same thing with the third principal part, because that would be at the time from which something happened. At the time from getting back home, I went to bed. So it emphasizes the immediacy of one action following the other. Wow, that's awesome. But I also want to check what it would be like if we went with the word after. So our word for after is kyuku, which comes out as suk in the modern form. Now, if we went with this, that would mean that it would have to attach to the first principal part, because it's a postposition, and so it's going to assign the accusative. Or, alternatively, we could say that this is a relatively new converb, and because of that, it attaches to the gerund. Because with the principal parts, they are old enough that they essentially affix straight onto the verb stem, and the verb is just sort of zero-derived and treated as being a noun. Whereas if we say this particular converb happened to evolve later on in history, after the point that was no longer really an option, you had to nominalize the verb stem first, the gerund is probably the way that you would do that. So if we went with the first principal part, that would come out as something like inyuk, because the coda N would assimilate to the palatal, and that would stop the palatal from turning into an S, because the palatal goes to a y after vowels unless it's bordering a consonant that is not palatal. Whereas if we went with a gerund, then it would turn into an S. I actually like the first principal part option more. We don't have very many NY clusters yet, but those are nice. But still, we can totally use the gerund for other converbs if need be. That is a possibility that is open to us. I do really like this form that comes from this word, after, which ultimately is from a verb that means to follow, but I don't know exactly what difference in meaning it will have to the consecutive. It could be that this language just has multiple consecutive or posterior converbs. That happens all the time. In fact, that happens in Achwach. Or it could have a slightly different meaning, but I'm not sure what that meaning would be. So I'm looking through the Achwach paper some more for some inspiration, and this so-called non-posterior converb is quite fun. It means that the main verb happens so quickly that the converb doesn't have the chance to happen. Like, calm down before something unpleasant happens to you. So it's got an inherently, quasi-negative meaning. It's like, calm down so that something unpleasant doesn't happen to you. That's really interesting. And now we're on to conditionals, which is something else that I have on the to-do list. It seems that there's quite a bit of overlap between the concessive and the conditional, which is also a thing in Manchu and some of the other languages I've looked at. It's actually just occurred to me that this meaning of follow actually lends itself quite well to a resultative meaning, because while it does give rise to this word that means after, it's also giving us this word that means therefore or as a consequence. So it could be a resultative converb, but if that's the case, would it perhaps make more sense for it to be the third principal part? Because it's following from something. Following from working all day, I felt tired. Alternatively, since follow is a verb, it would technically assign the accusative. Or again, we could do both, and just say that they have different meanings. Maybe one of them is a resultative and the other is something else. We're kind of going off the topic of coordination, and now I'm just thinking about converbs. But this is on the list, like this point that I have written here about clause chaining. Mostly that's just a question of how many and what types of converbs we have, because obviously that's one of the things that converbs are most often used for. So we're sort of killing two birds with one stone here. It occurs to me that we could use a word like against for a concessive meaning, which is, although. And I'd forgotten this, we actually have two different words for against. One that comes from an old word that means to fight, which I've specifically stated is the more malefactive word, whereas simitin, which we're using for the reciprocal, just has a more general sense of oppositeness. I think this one works slightly better. Now we could say that that is built off of the first principal part, or it could be built off the gerund. But even if it's built off the gerund, it would still need to take the accusative marking, because the gerund is the object of the verb to oppose. But the gerund is inanimate, which means that in the proto-lang it had no accusative form. So the gerund wouldn't need a case marker, so it would combine into uchsinta. So that would be our concessive converb. Okay, I think I'm going to have to stop there, because as much as I'd love to continue thinking about converbs, I am over time, and there are a couple of things I need to go away and think about before we can continue. But we've got the gist of coordination done, and coined a few converbs while we're at it. So now let's wrap things up with an example sentence. Okay, so for this example sentence, we obviously have to have a coordinated noun phrase, and a coordinated verb phrase and/or clause, and it would be fun to use one of our other converbs as well, so either a resultative or a concessive, or both. So for our coordinated noun phrase, do we have a word for dog? No, we don't. Well, that can be our new word, which is actually quite appropriate because I've been thinking quite a lot about dogs recently for the domestication video I'm working on. It's funny that the very first potential form I have on this list is kulbun, because it sounds kind of like kalb, which is the Arabic word for dog. Or is it? Because I always get mixed up between kalb and kalb. One of them means dog and one of them means heart, because in Turkish the word for heart is kalb as well, but obviously Turkish doesn't have uvulas. Okay, after a bit of deliberation, I quite like the form yauke. Turns out we haven't actually used the syllable yao anywhere else in this language so far. I realize now that since it's an animate noun, that final vowel will have to be a low vowel, which is fine, and those would be all the forms for it. So now back to the example sentence. Oh, and I forgot, we might as well throw in a reflexive, if we can, with our new reflexive pronoun, which in this case, since we're dealing with multiple participants, we might as well make it a reciprocal. We've got a cat and a dog. What are they doing? Doing something to each other. Do we have a word for to play? We do not. They climbed a tree. We want a consecutive action. Even though it doesn't make much semantic sense in this context, let's use the word for to wash. because that's one of those unaccusative verbs that's kind of inherently reflexive-y. So the cat and the dog climbed a tree and then washed each other. Got a coordinated noun phrase and a coordinated verb phrase, and we've got a reciprocal, so we just need a resultative or a concessive, or both. How about because they were friends? Okay, so let's start with the cat and the dog. We just coined the word for dog, and I actually misremembered we don't have a word for cat, but we do have a word for big cat or leopard, which maybe can also be used just to mean like house cat, or they could be related in some way. Okay, let's just assume that the word irmai can also just mean cat, as opposed to specifically big cat. So then we need our coordinator, which is lch, and I didn't even think about this, but it just so happens that both of these words would take the H form. So if it's the cat and the dog, then it would be irmai lchjauka, whereas if it was the dog and the cat, it would be jauka lchirmai. So that's the cat and the dog. Let's actually do the because clause first. So the verb of this clause is actually the copula, because they were friends. So for now, let's assume that the resultative is the first principal part. So the first principal part of the copula is isin, and then we stick on this yk ending. Then we need the word for friends, which is lich. Now, would friends be in the dual here? I think it would, because there's two of them, and they're both friends. And since it's a copula, it'll just be in the nominative. So that's because they were friends, or as a result of being friends. So the cat and the dog climbed a tree. The word for tree is osto, which in the accusative is ostos. So I apparently misremembered. I thought we had a verb that means to climb, but it turns out we don't. We only have a protoform that meant to climb, but now means to increase or to rise. Okay, we're going to need a different verb then. Let's go with to reach, because why not? I forgot to work out what tense we're doing. Let's just go with the remote past, just for the hell of it. So that's the third principal part and form 2 of the auxiliary. But wait a minute. No, I just screwed that up. Because this clause, the cat and the dog climbed a tree, should take the consecutive converb. It's only the last clause, they washed each other, that's the finite clause. Okay, let me try this again. You've got a cat and a dog. So it's like, at the time the cat and the dog arrived at the tree. So the consecutive is the third principal part plus the achin ending. Okay, I'm actually coming back from the future to re-record this part, because I realize I made a couple of errors here. First of all, I just kind of naively assumed that we'd be okay to add the achin ending just directly onto the third principal part, but I forgot that, at least in this instance with this word qeret, that form is specifically a result of infixation, which happens because of word final vowel loss, whereas if it's got this suffix at the end, that will block word final vowel loss. So metathesis will still happen, but there won't be an epenthetic vowel, and because of that the S won't roticize, so it would be qstöchin. Then we have the auxiliary for a plural animate subject, and then the reflexive pronoun hundus, which in this instance would actually be optional, because again, to wash is one of these unaccusative verbs, then simitin to specify that it's a reciprocal action, and then the word for to wash in the third principal part, and I only realized while I was editing this episode that I forgot to include the mediopassive prefix, so it would have to be tajamalre. So the actual sentence would be Irmai lechauka lyhynduisinjuk ostos qstöchin tirai hundus simitin tajamalre. Okay, so that'll do it for this episode. Tune in next time when we continue to coin some more converbs and probably tackle conditionals as well. And again, do let me know if you'd rather see the declensions get worked out in an actual episode, or whether you'd be content for me to do that on my own time. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you again soon for the next episode.